live in Phoenix, Arizona, and the summer here can be a bit brutal. My grandparents own a cabin up in the woods in the northern part of the state, and once or twice a year we like to go up there to decompress. It was mid-July, and I had just worked 8 days straight. I had 3 days off in a row, and I decided I would head up to the Pines. It was a spontaneous idea, so I couldn't get anybody to go with me. The only ones who came with me were my 2 small French bulldogs. We left the valley and headed up that way, and it was a nice feel that the temperature dropped immediately after ascending into the mountains. I could tell the dogs were loving the nice clean air, and I was excited to spend the weekend with them in solitude. We arrived at the cabin. It's on a dirt road on a couple of acres. There wasn't another house for another quarter of a mile or so on that same dirt road. No streetlights, no noises of busy streets or freeways, and no light pollution at all. It was 9:15 p.m., and everything was pitch black. I unlocked the door, set down my first set of bags, and went back to get the dogs out of the car. The 4-hour drive drained me, so I sat on the couch with the TV on and drifted off to sleep. A couple of hours later, I awoke abruptly to my 2 dogs barking aggressively at the big windows in the living room. I turned off the TV and all the lights so that I could see what was outside. I've never feared the dark or the woods, but still to this day, when I think about this moment, I get chills down my spine. I felt an unusual feeling of being watched, and I did not like it at all. The dogs were still going crazy, but I couldn't really see much. I definitely was not going outside. I eventually drifted back to sleep just to be woken up again. This time, the dogs were barking at the windows on the other side of the house. I went over there to look out the window, and it was cracked open. There was a stick in the window sill preventing it from being opened. I wasn't sure if it was already like this when I got there, or if somebody had just tried to open the window. Needless to say, I was on high alert. Another hour went by, and it was 3 a.m. I decided to call my grandma, who was 3 hours ahead on the East Coast, and ask her about it. She could have left the window cracked last time she was at the cabin. I found out that I had no reception, and that was when I really started to panic. The dreadful feeling of being watched had been replaced by the feeling of being hunted, and I didn't know why. The dogs were on high alert also. I just had to make it 3 more hours until the sun came up. Then I was going to get in my car and head back home. Suddenly, I saw the porch light shut off, and I tried to turn it back on, but the power had been cut. I tried to dial 911, but again there was no reception. Now, all the time someone had told me to invest in a firearm flashed in my head, and I really wished I had one, but I didn't. I was armed with a kitchen knife instead, and a heavy-duty walking stick. The 2 dogs, although not violent, seemed to be warding off this thing or person so far. A part of me wanted to go hit the breaker outside, but I didn't think that was wise. Whatever or whoever was doing that had probably set a trap for me out there. Just as I was sitting there thinking of how I could swiftly exit, I heard the sound of shattering glass, and behind it a man tall and slim speaking a language I had never heard. I froze in shock, but my dogs retreated to the back bedroom, so I snapped out of it and followed them. I was in my grandparents' bedroom. I slammed the door behind us and barricaded it with a dresser. There was a window in the room, and it was only a matter of time until that was breached. A million thoughts were racing through my head, and I couldn't help but notice my grandpa's old World War II memorabilia. I thought to myself that I bet Grandpa, who loved guns, had to have a gun stashed in there. I moved swiftly, looking for a firearm in my grandpa's room, and sure enough, I found one. An old World War II antique pistol, still intact with the original rounds. I wasn't sure if I would fire it or not, but I chambered a round just like I'd seen people do in video games. Just when I got done with the gun, the window in the bedroom shattered. The man stepped through it, and I squeezed the trigger and the gun went off. I'd never shot a real gun before, and it almost came out of my hand, but I know that I got him. He fell backwards and yelled at me and ran away. Now it was about 4:15 a.m., and I just needed to make it another 45 minutes until the sun came up, and then I could head to the nearest sheriff's office. I sat on the ground staring at the window, ready to fire another round for the remainder of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I took the dogs out to use the restroom as I was carrying the pistol under my shirt. The first thing I noticed was that my tires were slashed. So thankfully, it was a good idea I didn't try to make a quick run for it in the night. The next thing I noticed was the power box, the lock cut, and the power cut. After that, I noticed a trail of blood leading from the master bedroom window to the woods. I walked with the dogs about a mile down the road until I had some cell phone reception. I called 911 and told them what happened, then I called a towing company. I thought about walking to the neighbors, but the thought of him being the suspect popped into my mind, and I decided to contact authorities and keep to myself. I walked back to the cabin, and an hour later the sheriff came. He was an older guy who didn't seem to care much at all. He said it was probably just kids playing a prank, and I shouldn't have shot anybody. The sheriff even confiscated the gun and disassembled it right in front of me. Mad, confused, and tired, I waited for the tow truck driver who took the dogs and I back to Phoenix. A few things stuck in my head about that night. One of them being I never got the name of the sheriff because he never told me, and I was shaken up and didn't bother asking. I called the sheriff's office to follow up, but they had no record of the incident and no record of my grandfather's firearm. I still wonder to this day if the intruder survived the gunshot wound or not. I questioned if the man was a feral person, because I forgot to mention earlier that he had the strongest body odor I've ever smelt on a human before. I'll never know the answers to those questions. I'm just glad that everything turned out okay and my dogs and I didn't get injured. Needless to say, I won't be taking a solo trip to the cabin in the woods ever again. If I ever go back, I'm bringing my brothers with me, who both served as Marines and are not afraid of real violence. This happened a while back when I was living near El Paso, Texas, in a small desert town. For context, the houses in this area are not centralized in one town location, but rather in a 10-mile vicinity of cabins and small homes. We don't get much crime here, but when we do, it's scary. For example, a few miles to the east, where it's just desert for miles, is a meeting place of a local cult. It's a small group of like-minded crazies with the willpower to commit atrocities. A few years ago, one of their members broke into an office in town and took 2 workers hostage. Thankfully, they made it out with their lives. At the time, I was living in a small cabin north of town. I was 27 at the time and not someone to be messed with based on appearance. I'm 6'3" and work out quite often, so I was one of the bigger people in town. One night, a few days after Christmas, I was sitting near my fireplace getting warm and winding down. I had been working on my truck that afternoon because I had gone off-roading the day before and busted the suspension. To my surprise, I heard a loud knock on my old wooden door. I answered, "Who is it?" and then they just entered. 2 large men wearing large gray sombreros and holding Colt Python revolvers. My chair was far from the door and close to my bedroom, so I immediately rushed off to my bedroom during the ordeal and grabbed my double-barrel shotgun before the intruders were able to get to me. My shotgun was very large and very powerful, and I had 2 shells in place and not enough time to get to my ammo box, so I just had to hope this was enough. The guys rushed in after me, but when I placed my much larger barrel in their face, they were off and running. They rushed out as fast as they had arrived. I exited after them and fired a warning shot into the cold desert air. I didn't have a cell phone at this time, and my landline had been out of service for as long as I had it. I got into my old broken-down Ford, still a little broken from before, but I had fixed most of it. I rushed to the nearest law station and reported what happened. They took my shotgun for some reason and gave it back a week later. To this day, I don't know who was responsible, but I personally believe the cult put them up to it. Why I was chosen, I don't know. I never had any bad run-ins with anybody in town, and I've lived there for my whole life. When I was younger, my parents had a pretty large cabin house in the woods that we lived in. It was provided by a business partner in my dad's business as long as we'd pay the property tax. I guess he was holding on to the land, and he did actually end up selling it to a developer not long after we moved out. Anyway, it was on the edge of a large city, but still retained many acres of forest around the outside, and you would drive down this long gravel road to get to it. There was no gate or anything, and it was fairly peaceful, and nobody ever bothered us in 10 years, except for once. The house was essentially a log cabin and had 8 bedrooms, an 8-car garage, and a massive full-length deck in the back. The house was set on a slope and was 3 stories tall. The middle floor was at ground level at the front of the house, but a story up at the back of the house, which made the deck quite high. It was so high off the ground you could park a car under it and then some. The bottom floor was basically shared by my sister and I, and we drive around back and park under the deck where we had a separate entrance to a living room and all the downstairs bedrooms. It was like our own 3-bedroom and 3-bathroom house down there, but everything was built out of logs. This house had way too many windows at ground level and doors for my liking. It was difficult to keep them all locked. It was quite a chore going around and making sure that everything was locked each night. My dad had a habit of leaving a few unlocked windows or doors around the house every day, which didn't help. I think there were 19 external doors and even more windows, so it took a while to make sure each day that the house was secure. It was honestly large enough that somebody could break a window on one end and you wouldn't know, so I was always a little worried about break-ins. One night, as we walked out onto the upper deck, it was dusk and it was getting quite dark. My sister and I sat down on the chairs, chatting and looking at the sky. Only we could hear something moving around under the deck. It was faint, but there was something scratching, and we could kind of hear a shuffling around like somebody was trying to move but be quiet. But I thought nothing of it and thought that it was a cat or raccoon, as we'd seen them around before. In a deep voice, kind of as a joke, I said, "I know you're down there. Get out before I call the police." The moment I said this, a person in all black clothing sprinted from under the deck and into the darkening woods. Needless to say, we looked at each other surprised and kind of scared. Upon investigating further, the lurker had managed to open a bedroom window downstairs about 2 inches. I never slept good in the house again, and promptly screwed every ground floor window shut with security screws and bought a shotgun. During the daytime, I went walking around the property and discovered an area with a lot of cigarette butts and beer cans of various ages, very close to the edge of the woods with a full view of the back of the house. I have no idea how long they'd been watching the house. My thought is that they approached the backwoods and didn't even know we were home, so when we walked out onto the deck above them, they were caught and had to run off. I grew up in the country. It wasn't totally the middle of nowhere, but it was definitely a step down from the suburbs. Next to my house was a massive cornfield, but the houses on the other side and across the street were somewhat close, but I also lived on a 7-acre lot, so it was somewhere between a rural area and the suburbs. Anyways, at the back of the property there was a pretty large forest that eventually led to a nature trail, but before that there used to be a campground. This campground used to be a pretty popular place back in the day, long before we moved there, but it eventually closed abruptly. I don't know why exactly, but I'd heard talk about there being issues with drugs. There were also rumors that people had been attacked there. No one that we knew in the area who was there at the time really knew why it was closed, but the fact remains that it closed and they didn't tear anything down. They just left this abandoned camp, complete with cabins, a mess hall, and other buildings, and a swimming pool. That in itself sounds creepy, and it was. But at the time this story takes place, I was very young, probably like 7 or 8, and I was also naive given my age. The forest and the abandoned camp were not part of our property, which ended when you got to the tree line. However, at the time, the owner of that property and my dad were friendly with each other, and this guy said he didn't care if we went back there, and he even let my dad hunt back there during deer season. One evening when my mom was working nights, my dad took my sister and I back there to explore. It wasn't dark yet, as it was the summer, but it was getting close by the time we headed back there. We explored a bit, though most of the big buildings were locked, and the pool was gross, plus there was a lot of spiders around. I was getting eager to get back, and it was also getting pretty dusky by the time we explored the cabins. They were all unlocked, and some didn't even have doors, so we were just looking around. In hindsight, this sounds like the beginning of a horror movie, but I didn't know any better at the time, and my dad is basically fearless. While we were out in one of the cabins, we heard voices outside of it. We peeked out of one of the windows and saw 2 30-something-year-old guys. They looked kind of rough and shifty, and they were talking loudly. It seemed like they were in some kind of a rush, and they had to hurry up and do something back there, like they were looking for something. Now, I have rarely seen my dad truly scared. While I wouldn't say he was exactly scared in this situation, I could tell he was uneasy, which was also unusual. He stood in the doorway of the cabin while my sister and I looked out the window. I was holding this loose brick I had picked up, and my dad told me to keep hold of it unless he told me to drop it, which for some reason sticks out to me. While watching through the window, I saw one of the guys look towards the cabin and make eye contact with my dad. Then they just stared at each other for a little bit. It seemed like forever at the time, but it probably wasn't that long to be honest, but by this point I was unsettled. It was the brick comment that my dad had made, like that made me realize this was potentially a dangerous situation. The guy then whispered something to the other guy, who looked at my dad as well, and then they just kind of had a silent standoff. Finally, the 2 guys walked away into the trees, and once he couldn't see them anymore, my dad ushered us out. We headed back down to the house, but my dad seemed uneasy still and kept looking behind us. We made it back with no problems, and nothing ever came from this encounter. My dad years later told me that neither of the people that day were the owner of the property, though I suppose they too could have been there with permission. But my dad had a bad feeling, which I already knew even back then, because he had asked us not to tell my mom. Like I said, nothing ever came of it, and maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Even so, it creeped us all out, especially given the supposed bad criminal history of this abandoned camp. My dad never took us into the woods after that, at least not to the campground, though he still did hunt back there. All these years later, and I still don't want to go back there. When I was in college, a few of my high school friends and I loved hanging out on the weekends. We would often sit in our local woods, buy alcohol, and have a few drinks together. On one Saturday in July, we decided to head out to a forest a few miles away. It was daylight, and we planned to explore as much of it as possible before it got dark. The forest was really dense in most places, and a lot of daylight would be shrouded in shadow even when the sun was at its highest, but it was calm and peaceful. The forest was located behind a prison, which added some fear, but seeing as though it was daylight, we didn't think too much of it. Once we stepped into the forest, we pushed our way through the dense trees for about 45 minutes. We were chatting away and just catching up as friends do. Not long after, we saw something through the trees in the near distance, and when we reached it, we noticed it was a fully built small cabin. It was a hexagonal shape with thick walls and sticks and mud for a roof. We noticed a huge deep fire pit next to the cabin and trash everywhere. It looked as though it was recently used. We were unsettled, but it was daylight and the forest was calm. We shared thoughts of who could have built it and even suggested that an escaped prisoner had wandered into the forest after escaping. Looking back on it now, an escaped prisoner wouldn't hide in a forest behind the prison and build a cabin. We were young though, and I guess we were just excited about a mystery. The cabin didn't have a door, so we knew there wasn't anything inside. We did head inside though to see what we could see, and when we all stepped in, we noticed a bunch of tools hanging on the log walls. Rusty saws, hammers, and screwdrivers. This unsettled us more, and we debated about leaving before whoever built this returned. But because we were young adults, and there were 4 of us, we thought we would be okay, and decided to not just stay, but to take these tools and head even deeper into the forest in an attempt to build our own cabin. A few hours later, and we'd only put up a few logs before we got bored. We decided to call it a day and head back home, but we left the tools where we had started building our cabin and neglected to return them. We were tired and had unintentionally forgotten about the tools after we had been laying around and resting for a while. Fast forward a week, and we decided to head back to the forest to find that cabin and to see if anything had changed and perhaps continue building our cabin. Before we set out, we bought a load of marshmallows from our local store so that we could start a fire in the fire pit and roast the marshmallows. When we got out to the forest, it was quite late and the sun was starting to set. This was the plan so that we could have a glowing fire in the dark with our drinks and snacks. When we reached the cabin, we noticed it had been destroyed. All the logs were torn down across the site. We debated what could have happened, but we figured that when the person or people who built it returned and found their tools had disappeared, they decided to tear down the cabin because it had been found. We were worried about somebody coming back when the fire had lit, but we still wanted to stick to the plan as much as possible. For a while, we had a great time. We had a few drinks, roasted marshmallows, and my friend who brought his guitar played us a few songs. After an hour or so, we saw flashlights between the trees some distance away, followed by shouting. We noticed there were a few men heading towards us, but because the forest was so dense, it was slowing them down. We looked at each other and tried to come up with an idea. We knew the forest would be too hard to navigate in the dark, especially to the south where it became even thicker, and we'd be cornered. Devin and I really wanted to run, but the other 2 thought that they'd get caught anyway, and were trying to either hide in the area or try to reason with the men. Me and Devin ran for it. We didn't want to head to either side of the men because they would cut us off, so the only option was south, into a deeper and thicker forest. We each had a flashlight of our own, but we tried to hide as much of the light as possible so the men following us would either lose us or not see us. After a grueling 20 minutes of running through thick forest, which had scratched almost every part of our bodies, we came to a barbed wire farmer's fence. We looked back and couldn't see anything, but we could hear the men in the distance. We knew that we didn't have long, and this fence went on and on both ways. We decided to climb the fence and hope that the men wouldn't follow, so both of us started to climb. I managed to take my hoodie from around my waist and cover some of the barbed wire, but inevitably some did cut us. We managed to make it over to the other side, and instead of continuing south, we decided to travel along the fence until we found a way back through and around the men. We had no idea what was happening to our other 2 friends. We didn't though because we were worried about getting in trouble for trespassing now on whoever's farm property we had just hopped onto. After a while, we came across a section we could hop over safely and into a less dense part of the forest. We had no signal on our phones and couldn't call either of our other 2 friends to see if they were okay. We continued for a little while longer and came across an exit to the forest. We couldn't hear anything behind us, but we could now see some houses in the distance. We decided to head to the houses and under the street lamps before deciding what to do next. But as we got closer, we could see that our other friends were already under a street lamp near the houses. We ran up to them and asked them what had happened. They went on to say that they decided to hide because they had the guitar and couldn't effectively run with it, and it worked. The men arrived at the fire, while they just hid behind some logs just out of the firelight. They said the men looked to be a lot older than us, and seemed very aggressive with what they thought were crowbars or something similar. As the men heard Devin and I pushing through the forest, they decided to go after us into the dense woods, and our 2 friends had managed to make an easy escape. As they were walking towards the edge of the forest, they noticed a pickup truck parked on the logging trail with its headlights on, but no one inside. We think it was their truck. They all ran out towards the local houses where they found us. We went back to that forest a few more times, but never ventured as deep as we went that day.